Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our live stream. I'm Tom Nance. I'm the Manager of Policy and Programs from Western Sydney Community Forum. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're all on. We're all on unceded sovereign land. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends who join us today. Today is going to be an interesting discussion, and today it's all about jabs and jobs. You guessed it. It's about COVID-19 vaccinations, but more specifically, what it means for the not-for-profit industry. Now, the issue of vaccination is divisive. You don't need me to tell you that. And there's incredibly strong views on both sides. As we race towards 80% and potentially 90% in terms of our population's vaccination, it's important to acknowledge that there's still a small cohort of people who are choosing not to vaccinate against COVID-19. Today isn't about debating whether people should or shouldn't be vaccinated. I don't think there's any info I can share with our viewers today that they haven't already had access to inform their position. Today's about the responsibilities we have as a sector to keep people safe and how to navigate the complexities that come with that. Against the backdrop of vaccine mandates in certain parts of the sector, as well as the Department of Family and Community Services, Department of Family and, let's wrap that, the COVID-19 vaccination policy for service providers, which will be released soon. It's important for us to consider the health and legal perspectives, along with our obligations as employers. Now, we've got a jam-packed agenda today, but what I want to offer you is the chance to ask questions. That's what today is all about. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. Firstly, you can raise your hand if you're with us on Zoom. That means we get to hear your lovely voice. We're not alone, and often it feels lonely up here on the panel, and we get to hear your question in real time and our panelists can answer it. Alternatively, you can type in your question into the Q&A box and I will route it to one of our panelists. If you're joining us on YouTube today, welcome. Your option is to type into the YouTube chat, and what will happen is our YouTube correspondent will pipe the question into me. So we'll do our best to respond to the questions, and no doubt there's going to be a lot of them today. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists, and we've got a great panel today to answer your questions. Firstly, we have Eleri Morgan-Thomas, and she's the Executive Director of Partnerships at the Department of Communities and Justice. I finally got it right, hooray. The second panelist joining us today is Dr. Stephen Conaty. He's the Deputy Controller, PHRB, in Southwestern Sydney Local Health District. Welcome, Stephen. And finally, we have Savi Manii rounding out our panel, and she's one of the managers at Justice Connect. Thank you all for joining me today. So, Stephen, I'm going to go to you first. And obviously, today's had a few curveballs in terms of announcements. But, you know, we're still operating under the assumption that by the 1st of December, we'll have around 90% of the population vaccinated. If that's the case, is there a need for workspaces to enforce employee vaccination? Won't we be safe at 90%?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tom, and welcome to everyone. And look, will we be safe? I suppose. Well, first, there's a first part of the question is about general community, or what's going to happen. Are we going to see any further cases? And I think as we're opening up, and we seem to be opening up a bit faster now. So under the new premier, so and there's an expectation that we will. We will see cases because it hasn't gone away. I mean, we're still sort of seeing in Southwestern Sydney, I think we're probably still around 100 cases a day. So we expect that when there is a bit more opening up, more contact between people, then we'll get a small increase. Now, it's not, what's unclear is exactly how much of an increase, exactly the timing, so how good are we at how effective we've been at suppressing cases, but there's no doubt that eventually they'll pop up again, and we'll be seeing that we'll be back to rates around about somewhere between 500 and a couple of thousand cases a day, something like that. I think and it may be the school openings kick that along. We'll have to wait and see. But so that's a bit of an unknown, but but ballpark, that's probably where we'll be. So there'll be some risk to everyone, to staff and to clients. Now, the risk will mainly be to people who are unvaccinated, but you know, there will be. It's not as if vaccinated people can't get infected. So we've seen that happens. They tend not to get very severe disease, but they can transmit it on. So we will see COVID. It will be part of our sort of normal part of our life. And then in terms of our obligations, or what as a sector, or and what that means for us. Well, thinking about the health sector, which is something that I know best, and we can sort of extrapolate from there. Obviously, the health sector, we need to protect our employees, because they see people who have got COVID because they come through the front door, the emergency departments and the wards. But they're also sorry about the dog in the background there. So they're also we also we've also got very vulnerable clients, and of course, if healthcare workers become infected, they can affect clients, and so that's an important part of protecting our clients. Now, if we look at other parts of the health sector and going into NGOs and people that many of the NGOs have got some relationship with the health sector, they might get some funding from the health sector, and they're sort of covered by partly by that public health order because they might have some relationship with New South Wales Health. Then they see vulnerable clients as well. If we look at a sector which some NGOs might have something to do with, like the disability sector, we've seen a lot of disability workers get infected, a lot of their clients get infected, and so some way of mitigating that risk is probably really important. And so I think there'll be ongoing obligations for employers to try and protect their staff and protect their clients. And so it's just to what extent that obligation will be reinforced through legislation or public health orders. Public health orders tend to be time limited, and so they'll go away eventually. They won't be part of the landscape, but there may be other things that might come in to replace them.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And definitely, you're right. A lot of the clients that you see within the health system often overlap in terms of vulnerability in the not-for-profit sector. And I'm going to cross to you now, Eleri. Now, we've, of course, got the recent announcement from you, like a lot of DCJ-funded services did, around the fact that DCJ was developing a COVID-19 vaccination policy for service providers, and it was still in its draft stage at that stage. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I think the headline is that it's no longer called a vaccination policy. It's now called a COVID-19 management policy. So, and the reason for that is actually some of the work that Justice Connect's done that Savi's going to talk about, because, we had to get legal advice on actually what we're able to require organisations to do. And because part of the, we can't say to you, NGOs, that all of the staff that work in the services that we fund must be vaccinated. That's actually your responsibility as an organisation to do a safety and risk assessment around that, and to determine whether or not that's appropriate for the workplace that you're in. And workplace we define very broadly. So what you will get maybe tomorrow, maybe early next week, so it's pretty close to going out now, it'll be a COVID-19 management policy, and it'll tell you who it refers to. It'll have a requirement that is a thing that you must do. You must have a COVID-19 management plan. Mm-hmm. And then we expect and require are kind of two different words. We mm-hmm. expect that it'll have the following things in it, one of which will about making a decision about vaccination after you've done the risk assessment. But there's also a whole lot of other environmental controls that organisations can put in place around the use of PPE, how many people you have in the workplace, where you might see clients, and those sorts of things. So we expect that all employers will have a management, we're going to require that all employers will have a management plan, and we're saying this is what should be in it. Now, that's going to freak a whole lot of people out. I've got to go and do a risk assessment, don't know how to do that. So, and what do we do about clients? And, we're starting to hear all of those people really worried about that stuff. They are great things to be worried about. The fact that we're not going to just put a policy on you and then go, right, go and do it and you'll get into trouble if you don't. Actually, we have to do a whole lot of things as well. And we're working with the peaks on the supports they can provide to help you work through what a risk assessment looks like. And it'll be different for each organisation. As Stephen was saying, if you have disability in your organisation, you're going to be in a really different situation to if you're a neighbourhood centre or a childcare or something like, or you're running a homelessness service with a whole lot of vulnerable people in a congregate environment. So we will provide some guidance around those things that will assist, but it's going to take us a little while, but we're moving as fast as we can, and it is coming. You don't have to have all of those things on place on Monday, I think would be the key thing I'd say. Like on Monday, sure, things change and you're able to do more things, doesn't mean you have to. So, I'm going to be doing the same thing on Monday as I am on Friday, pretty much working from home and not going outdoors. But it means that you can ease into those things. It doesn't mean you have to change everything on Monday, and we're certainly not requiring people to do that. So you can expect to see that policy soon, and it'll be a notified policy, which means it'll become part of your contract. But what we really want is you to be able to do it and do all that stuff safely and do it well. So it's in our interest to actually help you do that, and not just chuck you in the deep end and go, here you go. So that's kind of where that's up to. You'll see it soon. It's not a very long document. And we've tried to sort of pare it back and tell you the key things you need to know. At the back, there's a helpful list of things where you get more information, some of which is Justice Connect.
Fantastic. And you heard it here first, viewers. It's now a management plan. So on that, Savi, I want to cross to you. And, as Eleri said, of course, there are a lot of controls that not-for-profits can put in place. Choices around the vaccination of its staff or not, it's just one of those levers, right? However, what are some of it's probably the one that not-for-profits are thinking about most at this point, I would be safe to say, considering the conversations I've had. What are some of the legal considerations employers and employees as well must be aware of when it comes to making decisions around whether vaccines are required as part of their organisational service delivery?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks. It's great to be here, and great to hear about the plans from DCJ, Eleri, as well, around that management plan and how that will work. So yeah, look, I think this is a really fraught area. So we've gotten lots of interest, particularly through engagement with our webinars, our hot topic webinars that we've put out on these issues. Our first one, which we ran a few weeks ago, had, with just a few days worth of publicity, about 600 attendees. We're running one now at this stage, I think at this moment, for Victorian-based organisations. We've got another one on Monday that is again looking at the legal implications of mandatory vaccines in the workplace. That is for, the one on Monday is of Victorian organisations, and the one today is for NGOs, health NGOs that are funded by New South Wales Health. So there's just an unending appetite for information from organisations around how to navigate all these competing legal obligations, because you've got, on the one hand, in some cases, mandatory directions that are coming through public health orders, laws that organisations have to comply with. But then you have these grey areas where you have a bit of latitude around whether or not you mandate vaccinations in the workplace. And so if you do, what are the considerations? So how do you comply with your work health and safety obligations? Do you end up with unfair dismissal claims as a result of mandating vaccinations? Can this lead to workers' compensation claims because you mandated the vaccine and now it's resulted in an injured worker, or you didn't mandate the vaccine and it's resulted in a client or an employee getting COVID. So either end, you're exposed. So what we've been seeing is that organisations are feeling incredibly anxious around how to navigate these decisions because there are competing obligations. It is not black and white. And it really, once you start to pull that string, what we're finding is that it results in all these sort of questions, the Pandora's box, which come up like, we've dealt with the workplace thing and public health orders make it a lot easier to do that. But then how do we engage with clients now? Can we refuse service to individuals, service users who haven't been vaccinated? Is that a lawful thing? Or do we end up potentially discriminating against those individuals? How do we field requests from service users to only engage with staff that are vaccinated? Are we allowed to provide that information to service users around which staff have been vaccinated and create a pool of employees that only have been? It's a complete minefield. So I guess I'm here to say that these are not easy and they're really novel questions as well, a lot of which the law really hasn't had to deal with in these specific contexts. But essentially the main, the three reasons how you can mandate a vaccine is through a specific law. So as we talk about public health orders, this is a less common one, but sometimes you can find in enterprise agreements or awards specific provisions that require workers in that industry to be vaccinated. So employers can rely on that provision in requiring their workers to be vaccinated. And then there's there's a more amorphous area, which is around a lawful and reasonable direction, which is essentially what Eleri was talking about around doing. Organisations are subject to strict work health and safety obligations. So they have a duty to guard against foreseeable risks of harm, not just for their workers. This under work health and safety legislation, the obligation is quite broad and extends to a large group of people. So you have the staff, you have contractors, you have consultants, you have volunteers, you have service users, clients, customers. So it's a whole group of people. And the organisation is in a position where they have to do a mental calculation around, what are the types of risks that these individuals that I'm responsible for could potentially face as they engage with the organisation. So this is not something that you can have a blanket policy on. So we would generally advise an organisation from just having a blanket policy where they just mandate COVID-19 vaccinations. It does need to be a nuanced approach. So really even on an individual employee basis, where you're kind of thinking about what is that employee's circumstances? Are they in a vulnerable position health-wise? Do they have the capacity to work from home instead? And you'd be thinking about the physical constraints of the space that you work in. Does it allow for COVID safe practices to be engaged? Is it too small? Can it permit for social distancing? What are the case numbers like in the particular area, the region where your office is located? What are the client cohorts? What's their vulnerability like? So there are all these considerations that come into essentially this risk matrix that you're developing. And hopefully what you end up with is a fairly sophisticated policy that isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, but maybe treats certain workers who do certain types of work who are maybe more vulnerable differently to others, but that sort of ultimate decision has been informed by a really thoughtful process, which you can rely on in justifying the approach that you've taken. Sorry, I hope that's sufficiently it's very broad, but yeah.
I think, Savi, it really illustrates the thing that not-for-profits are going to struggle with a lot. Because as you alluded to, there are three reasons. First is, the legal mandates, if you will, and that comes top-down. Not-for-profits don't have much control around that. Stuff around enterprise agreements, well, that again is quite broad. Whereas the third, which is where we're finding ourselves right now, is really that grey area, which is about often interpretation of law, but also really sits on the circumstances of each and every not-for-profit separately, which means it makes it incredibly complex for organisations to balance those risks. I think it's a really good point, well made though. And I see we've got a bunch of questions coming through already. Eleri, I'm going to go to you first. We've had a couple of questions, one from Julie Hillier, the other from Laurie Matthews, around something similar. It's just around wanting to clarify around vaccinations. So Julie, for example, talked about clarity from DCJ in terms of their expectations regarding staff vaccinations for staff working on DCJ-funded activities. And that we know that at DCJ, you've conducted your own risk assessment and come to the conclusion that a lot of your front-facing service that needs to be delivered by people who've been vaccinated. And likewise, Laurie talks about her risk assessment, and one of the key considerations there being potentially a risk of funding being stopped if they don't comply by having all of their staff vaccinated. Would you be able to comment on that and maybe clear some of that up?
Sure. And some of I've got the email in front of me that we sent out last week, and it hinged on a couple of words. And, you know, we had a lot of legal advice on what to write there. And what we mean by expect is, I expect it's probably going to rain on Sunday, but I don't know. I can't make that happen. I expect that's going to happen. So we said, we expect that staff will be vaccinated against COVID-19 unless they have a medical reason. So when we said expect, we meant this is what we think will happen. Then we told you what we did, which was we did our own risk assessment, because we also had to get legal advice on that. We did our own risk assessment and decided that all of our frontline staff and all of the people who work in corrections had to be vaccinated, and we've dealt with our own staff that way, some of whom didn't want to be vaccinated, but actually the majority have now see with escalating numbers, it's actually quite a good idea. So we told you what we've done in ours, and we think that and then we said, so we think that if you're doing the same or similar to the one services we're providing, you'll probably make the same assessment when you do a risk assessment. So we realised in some the feedback from that was very varied. Most people were in the survey thing that we sent out with it, most people were actually pretty positive, but there were some people who were thinking that we were telling you had to get your staff vaccinated, which is why we actually changed it now to a policy which requires you to have a plan and then says you've got to do a risk assessment, because that's actually in the Workplace Health and Safety Act. So this is what you need to do in order to decide whether your staff should be. Now, if one of you says, no way, I'm going to do a COVID-19 management plan, and somehow I find out about that, then actually that'll be a breach of the contract. Yeah. But if you say, I've done a risk assessment and there's no reason for my staff to get vaccinated because they're all working from an office in Iceland and teleporting in, so there's no reason for me to do that, then I have to accept your risk assessment. But you've required to have the plan, you did the risk assessment and went, well, that doesn't apply to me. And if you somehow make the surprising decision that none of your staff need to be vaccinated and they're working in close contact with people, unfortunately, I have to accept that because that's what we're asking you to do, but it's your decision and your organisational risk assessment that you're making. So that's where it lies. If you haven't got a plan, we'll be down on you like a ton of bricks. But then what you have in the plan is up to your own risk assessment. And that's why we'll tell you what we've done and how we came to the conclusion we did, because that's probably going to help you, because we've got way more people working on those sorts of things and access to too many lawyers and workplace health specialists and all of that stuff. And I know a lot of small organisations don't have that, but I hope that clarifies about what it is we want. You've got to have a plan, and then what you do is then your organisational decision.
Yeah, definitely useful. And I want to take this moment to shout out to all our friends in Iceland who've tuned in today. So I'm going to move on to our next question. And I've actually got a hand raised in the audience, so I'm going to throw to that one. Nadiana, you're on the hot mic.
Thanks for that, Tom. My question, well, firstly, thanks to all of you for your insights so far. It's been really valuable already, and it's been fabulous. So thank you. My question is mainly, well, to the whole panel, but to the points that you were talking about, Savi, in regards to all the legal stuff that services need to be considering. I guess my question is, where do services actually go to seek support regarding these kind of policies? Is this something that Justice Connect is doing? Is the Western Sydney Community Forum able to support? My kind of question is, broadly, in terms of the whole sector, what options are there for services? Thanks.
I'm happy to go first, if that's okay. Thank you so much for that question. And that is exactly what I actually wanted to touch on after I finished my long-winded spiel. So thank you for raising it. I promise it wasn't Dorothy Dixer, but so for those that aren't familiar with Justice Connect, just very quickly, we're a charity ourselves. We're an accredited community legal centre, and thanks to funding from DCJ in New South Wales, we're able to provide support to the sector with legal issues for free. So we're supported, we have our own sort of capacity in-house of really talented, amazing lawyers who are able to give legal advice. But what makes us really special is that we have the support of over 50 member law firms across across Australia, I apologise, who are made up of about 10,000 lawyers that can amplify the pro bono capacity that we have to assist the sector. So we love helping organisations, and like our biggest job is actually trying to find organisations that want to access support from us. Having said that, what we've done is we've gone out to our member law firms and we've said to them, look, this is obviously an emerging area. There's going to be really high need in this field, and they need specialist legal advice about how to navigate this complex area. And sometimes even it's just about sound checking. So you might have already done that process and you just want another set of eyes who has expertise to just give you the tick and just say, look, this is legally sound and you're going about it the right way. And that gives you a lot of comfort, even just something as simple as that. Or it could be you've got a specific question about, look, we have a staff member who's, despite this directive, has expressed that they're not willing to get the vaccination, in which case you really want to try and handle that with some kid gloves and get legal advice potentially before you take any action. So there's a whole range of issues, legal issues, that an organisation will butt up against as they try and work their way through this. So we have a number of law firms who've expressed interest in assisting organisations with this issue. What you would just do is you go onto our website at nfplaw.org.au /legal advice and lodge an online application form, and we'll make sure that we'll assess your inquiry. So generally we're there to assist organisations that have revenue of under $5 million and really are in the health or welfare space. So predominantly DCJ funded organisations or New South Wales Health funded organisations, and you're a not-for-profit. So if you kind of tick those really high level boxes, we should be in a position to be able to assist you with your issue and then connect you up with a firm. So firms won't always have capacity to assist, but we will do our best. And obviously we will be very upfront with you about what capacity is looking like. There's that side of things, which deals with the pointy end, really, where we need that tailored legal advice. But more broadly, we're constantly populating our website. We have over 400 freely available legal information resources that are in plain language, including tools and checklists and apps that deal with a whole gamut of legal issues. And we've been working really hard to populate our website with specific FAQs and guides on how to navigate this area. So mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations in the workplace, not just how it applies to employees, but also to volunteers as well. So there's a wealth of information already on our website that hopefully will answer your questions. And again, that's at nfplaw.org.au. And I encourage you to take a look there.
Awesome. And just a quick follow-up, Savi. When organisations have done their risk assessment, is that something that perhaps Justice Connect and your partners would be in a position to review in terms of that legal framework?
Yeah, potentially. I think that's where there's sort of specific questions about maybe the analysis and the criteria that have been taken into consideration, the weight that's been allocated to different criteria? Absolutely, because they'd be looking at it from the lens of work health and safety legislation and whether it meets the requirements under there. Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. And Stephen, I've got a couple of health questions for you. Megan Nicholson asks, when people get COVID, when they're vaccinated, what proportion get severe disease compared to the others? And what, for people who haven't got the vaccine, does disease look like? What's the kind of comparison between those two cohorts? And you're on mute, Stephen.
Right. Yeah, I probably can't give you an exact percentage, but the disease looks very different, and mostly we've got pretty good protection from the when you're fully vaccinated with 2 doses. So we've seen a couple of deaths that have occurred in very elderly people who probably don't amount to a very good immune response to the vaccine or to COVID. But when we go down into younger cohorts, it's very rare to get severe disease. So it looks quite different. Many people who have been fully vaccinated will get asymptomatic infections, so they won't realise that they are infected, but we can find it when we do a swab. So it's quite a different spectrum when people are infected and they're fully vaccinated.
Okay, fantastic. And a follow-up question as well. We've been seeing overseas in particular the rise of rapid antigen testing, right? If it becomes available in Australia and if it's accessible for not-for-profits, would you say that's potentially a mitigation strategy the employers could use for people who don't get vaccinated, or is it a bit too much of a risk, would you say?
Look, I think it depends on your industry, and so rat testing is certainly available in Australia, and so there's quite a bit of testing going on, but it's usually in some of the big industries. So it's food industry, food supply, warehousing. So not really the not-for-profits, but to talk about a company that I know well, they were previously doing surveillance testing of all their workers coming on site using they were originally using swabs. So they're doing that 3 times a week because they're a big, it's a process line, and so they put strenuous efforts into ensuring that workers were properly cohorted, that they were testing workers 3 times a week, and this is all to mitigate risk. And just in the last couple of weeks, they've switched from doing swab testing, that's the PCR testing, to the rat testing, which is also a swab, but it's processed on site, and so you get a quick answer back, and so that can be really valuable. I mean, their approach was also be to maximise vaccination rates, so their vaccination rates in their workforce, without being mandatory, well over 90%. And then what they've decided to do is that, okay, well, maybe we'll have this strategy of doing rat testing on our unvaccinated, because really they're going to be the people who are going to bring it into the work site. So they've thought, okay, we'll do this rat testing on them. So it's on-site testing, do a swab. We're finding out, okay, we're pretty confident this person is not bringing COVID into the workplace today. So those are the kind of the strategies you could think about. But these are big industries. They've got deep pockets because obviously if their production goes down, then they're losing money every day. Not quite applicable to maybe the not-for-profit sector, but again, that sort of gives you some illustration of the ways you can begin to think about risk and how I can mitigate risk if I've got these unvaccinated people coming to my workplace. So there's lots of different ways you can deal with that. Probably in the not-for-profits, we're probably thinking about something more like redeployment, or thinking about the ways that we can, there might be for the people who really don't want to be vaccinated. There's different strategies that can be employed. So there's lots to think about there, potential approaches to things, and so certainly the big industries have been thinking through this. And there'll be small lessons we can take from them to translate into the not-for-profit sector.
So, I mean, I've had some comments come in from Elizabeth O'Neill while you've been talking, Stephen, and she's asked, can it in fact be more dangerous if we're doing rapid antigen testing because people can be going out to their usual business with COVID, they're asymptomatic, and they might pass it on to others during that short crossover period? Would you mind? I'm not a person who knows much about health, so can you give me some insight on that, Stephen?
You mean transmission through the process of testing? Is that right? Or...
Yeah, and also just from being on site to go get tested when you have your antigen testing.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about industries where you have to be on site, so that's might be a point of difference with not-for-profit, but really through the process of testing, and like there's loads of people that have been tested, and if you think about the risk to others through that process, I mean, firstly, it's almost unheard of that we've had the actual swabbers or tested become infected. So it seems like the PPE that they wear, must be pretty effective. And so that's one point. And if we're so I don't think we should be really too concerned about having workers that are coming in to our work site if they're required to work there. So, and there's also declarations that people can make, so they can say, oh yeah, well, I haven't been to any of those places. I haven't got any of those symptoms. I don't have any close contacts in my household. So if they pass that sort of test, well, I think we should be reasonably confident that they're not going to be too much of a risk of bringing it themselves. But you can always be surprised. And of course, that's it's not as if and we deal with the surprises because we investigate the cases that turn up, but they're hopefully a small proportion of the total numbers of workers that we're talking about who are coming to work every day.
Thanks for that, Stephen. And I'm going across to a bit of an interesting topic that's been coming up in the questions. I might ask for your take on this first, Eleri. So a couple of our questions have alluded to the fact that there's anxiety from staff or from organisations about allowing unvaccinated service users to participate in groups or to be going out and doing home visits into households that haven't got the vaccine at this stage. In terms of, I guess, your view, Eleri, what's your take on that? Do services, I guess, as part of their risk mitigation strategies, need to think about the end user as well as their cohort or their staffing cohort, I should say?
Yeah, absolutely. And, like our DCJ's own staff are worried about that as well. Like in child protection setting, if you're going to a home, what do you do? And you're right, you deal with that through the risk management plan. So, in what I know that child protection workers are doing, for instance, if they're working in with foster carers and are going to have to do home visits, they're checking whether people have been vaccinated, and if not, they're working safely. So they might not go into the house; they might meet the family in the garden. So all of those things that actually people have had in place for the last year, 18 months, a lot of those things are still going to apply because nobody has you can't force somebody else to go and get vaccinated. And we can't deny service to people because, they're vulnerable people, but we have to work out how to manage our staff, but also how to encourage those clients to get vaccinated. And, look, I can see there's another question about how do you overcome the challenge of people getting vaccinated? And maybe if I can give you an example, not about DCJ particularly, because we've been fairly hardline, particularly in, say, corrections or something like that. It's no vaccination, no job. We use rapid antigen testing in prisons because we both have people coming in, but you're in a custodial setting, so some of your rights go out the window there because it's a different sort of setting. You can require things, but we have said to those staff, you're stood down if you're not going to get vaccinated because it's a requirement of your job. What I did have been talking recently to one of our large NGOs, so this is more like the workforces of the people on the live stream today, because if they had staff in the 12 LGAs of concern, they needed to have to be vaccinated in order to be able to leave the LGA. And what they did is initially tell their staff they all had to be vaccinated, and then there was a handful who didn't agree to be vaccinated. So it's going to be about the same as the population. 90% of people are going to be vaccinated. So you're dealing with the 10% for whatever reason. So I think out of their workforce, there was maybe a handful, and they talked to those people. And then there were 2 or 3 where they said, okay, if you're not going to get vaccinated, we will terminate your employment because we've made it a requirement. And at that point, 2 of them, or all of them accepted except one. And that one person said, I'm going to go to Fair Work and I'm going to take you for unfair dismissal, then got some legal advice, and then came back and said, okay, I'll take the jab. So because there's a really strong position from the unions that are they're actually supporting vaccination and things like that. So it's not like, now I don't want everybody to take that as a carte blanche that you can just go and do anything you like with your workforce. But, and the reality is if you don't go through it in the right way and make a risk assessment and communicate that and do all that, you could still get into trouble around those sorts of things. The key takeaway is actually you can talk people into it. And that it's actually the communication you have with your staff, which is going to be the really important thing. And what we know from everything that we've done in behavioural insights in the government, people are likely, if they're resistant, they're likely to get vaccinated because they're worried about risk to themselves, they're worried about risk to their family. And if somebody makes it really easy and goes with them, they're more likely to get vaccinated. So go with a friend and get vaccinated, or if you've got a vulnerable client, help them get to the place where they can get vaccinated and sort out, maybe they're like a Medicare card or something like that, help them do that, and they're more likely to get vaccinated. That's actually really important for everybody. So back to the beginning, yes, you do need to make sure your staff are safe, and that's part of your risk assessment about how you can do that in a way that doesn't deny service to people, but is still safe for your staff. Because, it's reasonable for them to be worried about that.
And if I can...
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to follow up and ask you a question, Savi, because we've heard that from Eleri, right?
Yes.
Now, from the legal side of it, there's a couple of things that spring to mind. The first is, as Eleri alluded to, we don't want to refuse service to anyone who's vulnerable, but at the same time, we might need to put caveats on it, i.e. meeting outside or participating in different groups. Also, there's the burden, if you will, for not-for-profits to be asking for the vaccination status or information for not only their employees, but the people attending their groups. And often people who haven't been vaccinated aren't necessarily happy giving up that information, as well as people who are vaccinated. Where do not-for-profits stand in terms of this space and this complexity?
Yeah, not great. You generally don't have an entitlement to, that's highly sensitive health information. So you can't just go around and ask service users whether they've, when they're engaging with your service, whether they've been vaccinated or not, on the privacy laws. And also, you don't know the reason why some service users may not be vaccinated. They may be not vaccinated because of, for example, pregnancy or a disability or health condition. And they, importantly, are protected attributes under state and federal discrimination laws. So if you were to refuse a service user access to your organisation services, and it turns out that that individual actually had a protected attribute, and the reason they haven't received the vaccination is for that reason, they might have a live claim against the organisation for discrimination. So you've got to be really careful, but at the same time, the organisation does need to manage the safety of its workforce. And so you would again constantly be doing this constant ongoing risk assessment, what are the types of services that are being delivered? What's the vulnerability of the workers? What are the case numbers at that stage, in that area? Can the work be safely done from home? So unfortunately, there's sort of no silver bullet where you can have a blanket rule that says no jab, no service. Because you could inadvertently get caught out. So it is really about doing that risk assessment. And conversely, service users asking staff, they don't have entitlement to the personal health information of staff members' vaccination status. But of course, the organisation, if they've imposed a mandate in the workplace and would have that information available to them, they can, without disclosing it to the service user, do a risk assessment of that user. You know, are they particularly vulnerable? Have they sort of not been able to get the vaccination because of a medical exemption? In which case they might then allocate staff member that has had vaccination to that individual. But you'd have to, it's a very sort of delicate dance in that you're trying to kind of meet that need, but at the same time not disclose personal health information of the worker. We have all of this information available on our website, so sort of in more detail. So again, I'd encourage the listeners today to go onto our website and have a look at these specific FAQs.
Yeah, and look, there's plenty of questions coming through as well. I acknowledge everyone that I won't be able to get all of your questions to the panel, but we will be trying to follow up a lot of these. And as Savi mentioned, there's a load of resources on their website, and Eleri as well mentioned that I've got to get the name right now, the COVID-19 management policy is expected imminently as well, and there'll be some more guidance around that. I've got time for a couple more questions though, and I'm just having a look at them.
One more point. I just keep plugging our resources, but Fair Work Ombudsman, the Fair Work Ombudsman has excellent resources, and they've kind of been the single source of truth for us. And we've directed lots of organisations to them. They've taken the time to really try and knock some of this information to shape, and they've got FAQs on their website. I really encourage people to look there, as well as Safe Work Australia. They have really helpful information from the perspective of work health and safety. How do you do risk assessments? They've, I think, even got template risk assessment plans, management plans that you can use to help you work through those questions. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Look, I'm glad you added that clarifying point. And Stephen, I'm now going across to you. So we've got a question from Ruth in the audience. And she says that given the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting COVID, and it doesn't prevent a vaccinated person from passing it on, how should that information be handled? Like, what do we make of that?
I'm not sure what the question's quite driving at, Tom, but I guess that's the fact about the vaccine. So no vaccine's perfect. These vaccines are pretty good. So so yes, you can get infected as a frontline worker, for example, and that's certainly occurred. It's occurred in our hospital system plenty of times. So yeah, we can't guarantee any perfect protection through requiring anyone to be vaccinated. So we can't vouch for that or guarantee that in any way. And yes, it's possible if that worker gets infected, then they can pass it on to others in their workplace or to clients. So that's just a fact, and that's going to be more of a reality, I suppose, down the track. I suppose most people in Australia, or at least in New South Wales, have been relatively recently vaccinated. We expect that immunity will wane over a bit of time, and so we might find that there is the vaccine is fully vaccinated people who might have been vaccinated. Many health workers were vaccinated back in March. Their immunity might wane, and so they might not be as fully protected as they imagine. So that's where all the booster stuff will come in, and that will be something that will start. I think people will start talking about that when various bodies make their decisions about that.
But I guess what you're getting at is the fact is that if you do get the jab, you're less likely to have adverse reactions. You're less likely to spread it, I believe. Have I got that correct, Stephen?
Correct.
So yeah. While of course there's no magic bullet to COVID, as we all know, there's definitely a safer route when it comes to that choice. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Stephen, but I'm just wanting to clarify that.
Sure.
Okay. We probably have time for one more question. And I'm going to give that one to you, Savi. So quite a few people in the chat are saying, look, on one hand, we're hearing from you that we can't really ask for vaccination information in terms of our clients. On the other hand, we're hearing that cafes, that retail stores are responsible for not letting people who haven't been vaccinated in their stores until after the 1st of December. I'm confused, if I'm honest. How does that work?
That's a really good question. And I don't know the specifics, but my understanding would be, if I had to think on my feet, was that there's a legal direction, basically, which is the same as in when there's a public health order, which requires certain workers to be vaccinated, or applies to certain industries. Then that there is a requirement in the public health order for that employer to ask the employee for the information. So the employee has to actually be forthcoming with that information, and the employer is permitted to ask that question in the first place. And that becomes a condition of employment. So they have to provide evidence of vaccination status. So when that happens, when there's a public health order or there's some other direction from government that's enshrined in law that is compelling people to get vaccinated, that changes the dynamic. Then there's laws still that apply around how you handle that personal health information. But in terms of the asking and then compelling someone to, you can't even compel them. So that individual can say, look, I'm not going to provide that health information. It's just private to me. And you can say, well, look, I'm really sorry, but that is a condition of employment. And so that's when you get into the territory of potentially taking disciplinary action. Whereas in these other situations, it's not, you don't have that really. There's no sort of, I think with not-for-profits, there hasn't been a public order that says that only vaccinated users can access services from a homelessness shelter, for example. So that's when you've got the privacy laws that kick in, and you've got to sort of abide by the parameters there.
Okay.
But I'll certainly take that on notice, and I will. I'll get back to you, Tom, if you want to share that afterwards to just clarify that. Hopefully, I'm on the right track, but that's a great question.
And Eleri, I'll go to you. You've patiently raised your hand.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between asking for the information, collecting the information and retaining it, and making a decision based on the information. So what I would say is that you can ask anybody anything you like. You can ask them, are you vaccinated? But if they won't tell you, then your assumption would be that they're not. So that means you might change the way you deliver service to them based on the answer to the question. And if they are vaccinated and are happy to share that with you, that's fine. Then you might do service delivery in a different way. So that's how you treat those things in a practical sense. Yeah. Unless you're in a position where you can enforce it. And if you have required as a condition of employment that your staff are vaccinated, well, obviously you've got to keep records around those sorts of things. And you know, when you're employing a new person, you can require it at that point. That's easier than you know, your existing staff. I acknowledge that. But that's how I would suggest you handle it. If you don't know what their vaccination status is, treat them as though they're unvaccinated.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Eleri. A really good point. And I'm aware we're running out of time, as often happens. So many amazing questions. So thank you to our audience for asking them. And as I say, we'll try and get to as many of them after this as possible as well. So I'm going to give this question to all three of you, and I might start with you first, Stephen. So what do you think is the most important thing for employers to consider as we move towards the end of lockdown?
Look, I don't feel like I'm necessarily the best person to answer that question, but I think in terms of what employers need to consider, it's really, I think, have a planned approach, and that's probably what Eleri and has been talking about in terms of their requirements, and we've asked industry and various groups to provide sort of risk assessment or frameworks for mitigating risk through their COVID safety plans, and so we're probably going to be moving into the same sort of territory as we have these as we are moving out of lockdown, and various parts of industry are going to be opening up again. So somewhat similar, but maybe more broadly linked into work health and safety.
Thanks, Stephen. And Savi, what about you? What do you think is the most important thing for employers to take away from this or to think about?
Yeah, I think there may be some who are listening today that are subject to public health orders, in which case that's a fairly straightforward process when it comes to managing vaccinations in the workplace. But for those who fall into trying to work out if the direction they're going to give is lawful and reasonable, the most important thing is the risk analysis. So really trying to consider those work health and safety requirements, factoring those into the decision about whether or not that's something, a mandatory vaccine policy is something that the workplace introduces, or if it doesn't, how does it manage the safety of its workers and those people who engage with the organisation in a way that doesn't eliminate the risk. An organisation does not have an obligation to eliminate risks. It's just do everything that's reasonably practicable to minimise that risk. So it's not a perfect science. So yeah, I think the work health and safety point is an important one that organisations will need to do, and they will now be required to do, which they would have already had to have done prior to the vaccine. This is just another thing that comes into it, but I would expect that most organisations would have a COVID risk management plan in place already, and maybe there's a bit of fine-tuning that needs to happen to introduce this concept of vaccinations. But yeah, I think that's the biggest takeaway.
And Eleri, you've got the second.
Of course, I'm going to say have a plan, but hasten slowly. You know, like you need to get one pretty quickly, but you don't have to have it on Monday. And you need time to get advice and think through it and consider the risks.
Yep.
And to Savi's point, you already had workplace health and safety risks. You're already worried about your clients being safe if they're, you know, I don't know, out in the bush, or, you know, sole workers working alone, meetings in offices. You already had to think about various risks. This is another one you've got to think about. And, you know, it's for all the organisations that DCJ funds, it's in our interest that you manage this well and that you come out of it okay and you're not exposing yourself to unnecessary legal risk. So we're not interested in somebody going down because of this. So like we want to help you, basically. We'll come out with a policy. We have funded Justice Connect. We're really keen on the stuff that Justice Connect's doing, but the peaks also will start to work on some of these things. So we're here to help, but we can't do it for you. But what we can give you is tools to help you do it.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm going to thank each of you. Thank you, Savi, from Justice Connect. Thank you, Stephen, of course, from South West Sydney Health District and my hometown of Liverpool. Thank you very much, Stephen. And finally, thank you, of course, Eleri Morgan-Thomas, the person who holds the record for most appearances on our live stream panel. So thank you, Eleri.
Thank you.
Well, that is the end of our live stream. There's a lot to digest. Normally I sum things up, but where to begin? What I am going to say is, firstly, this live stream is available on YouTube. So if you do need to send it to your colleagues, you can do that. If you need to watch it at your own leisure, you can do that as well. The information that we have today isn't going anywhere. As I said, we're going to try and get to all those questions that were asked as well. So please stand by as we chase those answers. The future is really uncertain. I'm going to be honest, but we're not going anywhere at Western Sydney Community Forum. This is a new curveball in a lot of ways for our organisation, but we're here and we're only a phone call or an email away. So please reach out. We may not have the answer, but we can help you find it. The main thing here, I think, that I take away from today is we really need to look after each other, and we need to look after the communities as well. That's what every risk assessment, no doubt, that we conduct is going to be around: how we best look after our people and how we best look after the communities we all serve. That's it from me. I hope you enjoyed the panel, and most importantly, stay safe. It's a strange world out there right now. Be good, and we'll see you all soon.